Hey everyone, this is Barrett from Cypress College, and in this lab recording today, we're going to cover the introduction to AWS Lambda. A lot of the labs we've been covering in this course have been based on the AWS Academy labs built into their Canvas platform. But this one, we're going to go outside of that. And just a reminder, we're going to be using the Qwiklabs free tier labs. So make sure that you've signed up for a free account at amazon.qwiklabs.com. And you'll find that the lab is very, very similar. We have a full lab walkthrough that you can use, and it takes you step by step. So first thing you want to do is just start the lab up here. And you're going to notice that it will provision the environment. It's going to be running that CloudFormation script that we've talked about. And it should take about a minute. And then once this launches, you will see a Launch Console page. So I'm going to pause the video and let this launch. Okay, great. So the lab has launched, and you'll notice now we have an Open Console link. So I'm going to go ahead and click that, and you'll notice that it opens a separate tab. And very similar to the other labs we've been working with, it will log you into your own AWS Management Console, and you're logged in as AWS student. So this is a sandbox lab environment. So nothing tied to you personally, and you're free to work on this lab. Once you're done, it will eventually close itself out. And you notice we have a 45-minute timer on this lab, which I think is plenty of time. And you could always redo these as many times as you want. So we are in compute week. So we were talking about the compute category, things like EC2 servers. But in this particular lab, we're going to be looking at serverless computing. So this is using AWS Lambda, which, taking a quick look at the overview, AWS Lambda is a compute service that runs your code in response to events, and it will automatically manage the compute resources for you. So you're only paying for what you use. You only pay for when these Lambda functions are triggered, right? So you tie them to a particular event, they trigger, you get charged for the amount of times they're triggered, and then any other, services that get used in consequence to that trigger, right? So in this case, we're going to, in fact, if I scroll up, we take a look at these 4 tasks. We can see that the lab is broken up. We're going to create an Amazon S3 bucket. We're going to create a Lambda function. We're going to test that function. And then we're going to take a look at the monitoring and logging of the function and how many times it was called, right? So by the end of this lab, you're going to be able to know how to create that Lambda function, configure an S3 bucket as a Lambda source, trigger a Lambda function by uploading an object to S3. So essentially, in fact, let me find here we go. This diagram really shows the flow of this lab really well. So essentially, we as a user, we're going to be uploading an image to a source bucket, and then we're going to create the second bucket basically called -resize. So that's going to be where our Lambda function will eventually put a resized thumbnail image of the image that we originally upload. So basically, whenever we upload a image to our S3 bucket, it's going to trigger a Lambda function. That Lambda function is going to then resize that image through code, which, don't worry, you don't have to write any code at all. Even if you know nothing about code, you will do absolutely fine in this lab. And we even talk about, even in the real world, there are times when you don't really need to know the code, right? You just need to know how to grab the code from someplace else and then input it in the right place, which is the Lambda function, and then tie all of these services together, right? So then finally that code will execute. It's going to resize the image, and then the final step is it's going to drop that into the second S3 bucket, which is for the resized images. So that's in a nutshell what this lab is all about and what we'll be building during this time. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this over to the left so I'm not moving back around between tabs. And First thing we want to do here, so remember we're at the console, we can access things from recently visited services. We can come up here to the services section, pull from here, or I always like to just kind of search. So we want to go into S3 first under our first task, which is create the Amazon S3 buckets. So we'll go into S3 and we want to create first a bucket that will just hold standard images that we upload that are full sized. And then we're going to create a second bucket that is the same name as the other one, but just dash resized. So let's go ahead and create a bucket here. You see, we already have a couple of buckets here. You could just ignore these, but let's create a new bucket. Let's call this images and then give it a random number if you want. Any kind of random number. Remember, bucket names are unique. So potentially if you try to name a bucket named images, I'm pretty sure it's taken out in the wild. So you will have to come up with a number affixed to this that is unique. We can keep it in US West 2 region. This is not related to this lab, but this is something you always want to make sure is enabled when you're creating S3 buckets, unless you have a very specific public access need. For example, if you're hosting a static website, that would make sense that you would make this S3 bucket public, but otherwise you want to assume that you want to keep your S3 buckets private. So if I disabled this, that would open up the bucket to the world and people can very easily scan the internet for these open buckets. So make sure that that stays enabled. Everything else here we'll leave at default, but in general with S3 buckets, and we are going to talk more about them and have labs dedicated to it, but versioning is very useful. If you accidentally delete something, you'll be able to pull back the earlier version, or just in general, it could be good practice to have the ability to revert back to an older version if needed. Tagging, in fact, I think I'll show you here. I noticed that even if we attempt a tag, so if we call this name image store, it's always best practice to tag your services, especially if you're working in a company and you're working with a group of either other cloud engineers or solutions architects, and that way everybody knows what everything is, right? So that's a good best case, best practice here. I think we are going to get a warning that we actually don't even have permissions to do that, but that's okay. Server-side encryption should always be enabled as a best practice for AWS. I'm going to leave that disabled for now, just for the lab. But advanced setting, object lock. This would be if you want to, potentially prevent things from being deleted or overwritten. All right, so let's go ahead and create this bucket. Oh, there we go. Okay, yeah, and I was correct. Insufficient permissions to apply bucket tagging. In general, if you ever get some warnings on things like this, don't stress too much. Sometimes these free labs, there are things that it attempts to trigger, but you just don't have permission because it's a free lab. So it doesn't necessarily mean that something is broken or anything like that. So, okay, so we see that I have my images 31337 S3 bucket. Now we want to create the second bucket that the Lambda function will be placing resized smaller thumbnails into. So we'll call it the same name, dash resized. Okay. Everything else I'm going to leave default. Go ahead and create that bucket. Cool. So we have two S3 buckets here. Now in the lab walkthrough, there is a link to a image called happyface.jpg. Okay. If you're on Firefox, it points out to make sure that you save it as JPG and not JPEG. Apparently that might cause some issues with the function, so just a heads up there. But I've already downloaded that, so I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop that in. All right, there we go. You could choose a drag and drop, or you could, of course, click on add files and browse through your hard drive, for example. So we have this, that's going to upload. And easy as that. We have happyface.jpg. If we click on it, we can open it here. So we can see that is the original, and it's fairly large size, 1280 by, what is that, by 853 pixels. All right, so we've completed task 1 at this point. So we're going to move on to task 2, which is creating the Lambda function. So let's go ahead and search for Lambda. So you can see the little tagline here, run code without thinking about servers. Remember, this is all about serverless computing. All right, so currently there are no functions. We have 0 functions. So we want to go ahead and create our first Lambda function. We'll go ahead and author from scratch here. You can see that there are blueprints. You could also use container images or browse a serverless app repository. So that's the cool thing about this. You know, I mentioned earlier, you don't, especially for this lab, you do not need to know code. And even in the wild, in the workforce, like as you get started, you'd be surprised. There's so many resources out there. There's a lot of repositories already out there where you could, you know, pull code for a potential project you want to do. And, you know, having like Python experience, for example, is very useful, because if you want to make some tweaks or maybe, you know, really specify it to the project you're working on, that would be very useful. But just to get you started, just to like actually work with these services, you do not need to necessarily know how to code. It's all about resourcing the right materials, right? So, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. You'll see in a second. So let's go ahead and call this function create-thumbnail. And for the runtime is just another word for what kind of programming language are we using here. So we're going to select Python 3.7 for this one. Under change default execution role, here we want to use a specific role that's already been created for this lab. So we'll use existing role. And you notice when you click here, it's pretty much selecting the only role that's available, and that is the Lambda execution role. And, you know, remember we talked about roles in the IAM portion of the course. And if you want, you could right click, open a new tab, and even take a look at this role. So what this is doing, it's going to allow Lambda to do certain things. So we could take a look at the JSON policy here, the IAM policy, I should say, that's formatted in JSON. Or if you want an easier look at it, just go to Access Advisor, and you could see, okay, it's allowing 2 services, and that is Amazon CloudWatch logs and Amazon S3. But now what specifically can it do? Well, let's go back to the permissions, and we could see that it's giving it access to the logs here. And then here it's for S3 specifically, it's allowing us to get an object, and it's also allowing the Lambda function to put an object. So you can imagine this is needed to get the object from the first S3 bucket where we uploaded happyface.jpg, right? And then we need the put object to eventually put that resized thumbnail into the second S3 bucket. And then under resource, this ARN is very important. It's the Amazon resource name. And it's basically saying any S3, it's allotting it to any S3 resource. Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it, because we have this asterisk here. Because every different S3 bucket is going to have a different ARN. So you could specify those 2 very specific S3 buckets, but this policy in general is just giving access to all S3 buckets, which sometimes that's what you want. Okay, so I'm going to close out of the policy. And so we're back here. So remember, we're still in that first phase of creating the function. And I believe we filled out everything we need. Yeah, we don't need anything under an advanced settings. We selected the role as the Lambda execution role, super important, and create the function. All right, cool. So here is our function. Remember, it's called create-thumbnail. We have some code that just shows up. This is a very simple hello world or hello from Lambda code, but don't worry about this. We're going to be using something completely different. But first thing we want to do is add a trigger, because we have a function, but we need to specify what's going to trigger that function, right? Because otherwise it's just going to sit there. It's never going to actually do anything unless there isn't a trigger. So when we click add trigger, you can see how you could pull from various different services, even our outside services. So you could run through Amazon Event Bridge. You can attach this to other security tools like Datadog, that is great for cloud security posture management, things like that. MongoDB for databases, PagerDuty for messaging services, Shopify, etc. But in this case, we're just sticking all within AWS, and we want to look at S3. And here we will specify the exact bucket. So remember, this function is to trigger when we upload an image, and we're uploading to this bucket right here. And we're going to keep this right on all object create events. So you could specify and get a little bit granular, but we're just going to keep this in general at all object create events. So whenever an object is created, this function will trigger. These we can leave blank, and just down here, acknowledge that using the same S3 bucket for both input and output is not recommended, and that this configuration could cause recursive invocations, increase Lambda usage, and increase costs. So remember, we're using separate buckets for input, one bucket for input, one bucket for output. So we are aware of that. All right, so that trigger is created, easy enough. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to bring in the code. So remember earlier I said you do not need to know coding, and this is especially true because we are literally going to upload the code that's currently sitting in a existing S3 bucket in this account, right? So remember seeing those S3 buckets that were already created. So we'll choose upload from in this top right corner, Amazon S3 bucket, or Amazon S3 location, sorry. Alternatively, we could just upload a zip file if we wanted from our own hard drive. And here you'll notice in the lab, and in fact, let me go ahead and pull this over. So the important part in the lab is to copy this link here. So you can click this button here, it'll add it to your clipboard. And you can see this is, in fact, a zip file as well, but there's no need to unzip that yourself. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that in. And so the one thing here is we won't be able to view the code source here, but you see here the deployment package of your Lambda function is too large to enable inline code editing. However, you could still invoke your function. But let me pull this over. We do have a snapshot of the code in the lab. So once again, you don't necessarily need to know this line for line, but you could definitely see that it's opening the image. It's going to resize it to 128 by 128. It's going to save the resized path. And you can see here, it knows that it's pulling the download path. It's specifying an upload path and adding that resized, or you could see it here, I'm sorry, the upload path, and then it's affixing dash resized. Because remember, we called that second S3 bucket the same name as the other one, dash resized, which this code, now that you see this, that you can understand why that was important, to keep the names similar, but with the dash resize, because it corresponds with how the Lambda function is built. Okay, so let me pull this back over. All right, and now our next step here under runtime settings, we're just going to want to click edit here, and we want to change the title of this handler. So we're going to call this create thumbnail dot handler, and then we'll go ahead and press save there. And now we will go to configuration, general configuration, and we could change this description here. So it's always good, like I said, similar to tagging S3 buckets, for example, or tagging EC2 instances when you launch them. You want other people on your team to know what this Lambda function is doing. So we'll just call this description, create a thumbnail sized image. And we can keep all of these at their default. Okay, you can see the description updated there. And that is it. So we press save on that. So that completes task 2. We successfully created the Lambda function. We added a trigger. We uploaded the code. Now moving on to task 3, and we're going to remain in this section here, but we're going to go ahead and test this function. So before we even implement it in the wild, we can run a test on this. So under template, we're going to change this to, I know that Lab says the template is called Amazon S3 Put, but if you just search for S3, you'll see S3 Put without the Amazon. So that's the one we could choose there. We'll call the name upload. Now this is the very important part, because there is a few things in here that we need to change related to our bucket name, and also related to the file that we want to run this test on, which, remember, that's going to be happyface.jpg. So here there's 2 sections where you see example bucket. So this is specifying the bucket name, you can see here. And remember, in my case, my bucket name was images-31337. Remember, yours is going to be slightly different, so make sure you input the correct bucket name here. And then finally, here, we also want to change example bucket to the same. And now we want to also change the object and the key, which is essentially just the file name. So that was, let me double check the lab. Yeah, so this is happyface with a capital H, capital F, .jpg. Okay, great. So that's all we need to change here, just those 3 things. And we will go ahead and click test. And I got a fail. Why did I get a fail? Okay, I always kind of don't mind when these fail, because I like to show, how things can be, you can go through some troubleshooting. So here, it would appear that I had a misspelling. So no module named create thumbnail. Is this related to my handler? Quite possibly. So let's go back to, yep, it is. So I came back to code here. And remember, when we set the runtime settings, I had a misspelling. So I'm going to go ahead and put that B in there, hit save, come back to test. Everything is still saved. Let me go ahead and run that test again. And now we succeeded. So if we got details again, we see the results of our successful test. We see the duration, how much memory was used, the build duration. So this is all really good stuff if you're building these functions. And then, eventually you might have to report this to your management to determine, okay, this is what I built. This is like the average cost, let me know if we can implement this, right, on a larger scale, because you have to determine, well, roughly how many times a month will this be triggered? What's going to be the average cost of this? So this is where this information can really come in handy. All right, so now, we looked at the details here. So now we ran that test, right, on Happy Face, so we should actually see the results of that. So let's go into S3. And we see, so this is the upload S3 bucket, right? Now we should see a resized thumbnail that was automatically done when that triggered just now. And sure enough, there we go. If we click on this here on the checkbox, we can open this. And there we go. Much, much smaller, right? So we have that thumbnail created, and let's go ahead and do a live test, right? So let's go back into the upload bucket. I'm going to go ahead and pull in a different image. So I kind of like this image here. I've been in a Matrix mood, waiting for Matrix 4 to come out. There is no cloud. It's only someone else's computer. So let's go ahead and drop this over into the bucket. No cloud. Oh, in fact, this is a JPEG. Let's see if it works. I actually think it still will. So let's upload. Okay. We go back to, this is the main bucket. We have both of those original images in there. So we go back to S3 now. Let's go into our resized folder. And sure enough, that worked. So you can use JPEG. And if we open this, we see that it got resized. Cool. So that is the main core of the lab. That brings us into task 4, which is just kind of looking at monitoring and logging with Lambda. So if we go back and search for Lambda, let's see what we could see here. So we have our function that we created here. So remember, the more functions you create, they would all show up right here. But we'll just go into create thumbnail. And if we click on the monitor tab here, we can see CloudWatch metrics. And you could start to see some activity here. So you can monitor, the duration of your function, error count and success rates, if there was any throttling that happened, invocations, I think this is not counting the test, so it's only showing one invocation, but you could test this out, upload a few more, and you could see them populate on these CloudWatch metrics. And we could also drill down deeper and view logs in CloudWatch. And then here, let's go to the latest one here. You can click on the log stream. And then here you can see every different request. You have the request ID, when it started, when it ended. And then here is the full report of that. So this is another way to look at the duration, the build duration, memory size, max memory used, etc. Cool. So that's basically it. Hopefully this gets you thinking about how Lambda functions can be used creatively to build these serverless architectures. This is a pretty simple use case, but definitely good for a first start. So thanks a lot for watching, and I will catch you in the next video.